This is Dave on the line, our speaker. Why don't you tell Dave a bit about your your business, and then Rob.
Brewster.
Yeah.
Well, I have two family businesses. One is a nationwide distributor of specialty foods. So cheeses, charcuterie, olives, crackers, croissants, hors d'oeuvres, all of that good stuff. We're both in food service and in retail, so we're in an interesting time. The other is a very small company that we just started 2007, winery on the North Fork of Long Island in New York. So over there there's only 4 of us in that company, so I do a bit more of a broad landscaping, social media, mailing list, website, all kinds of stuff.
Tell Dave Brewster about your the size of the company and your role.
The winery is quite small. We have basically my dad and his wife, me, and a general manager. And then we have 5 guys working in the field. So not that big. I mean, we have not yet hit $1 million in a single year yet. The other company, the food company, we're about 1,000 employees, 9 distribution centers, about 450 million annual revenue. So that was a bit bigger.
How's that business look? It sounds like some will be up and some will be down, given the retail versus the food service.
Oh yeah. It's changing the buying patterns and the behavior of consumers and our customers. So some just disappeared. You know, hotels, convention centers, restaurants, but retail is up. So that's interesting.
Mm-hmm. Rob, tell Dave about your business.
So we are a third generation diamond and jewelry business in the Diamond District in New York. And we are a small company, about 6 people. It's my brother and I that run it and own it. And we have been closed for the past 4 or 5 weeks, obviously, no revenue coming in. And it'll be interesting to see how quickly it comes back after this whole thing ends. I think that's the biggest X factor. Even if we start up in a month or whatever it is, you know, how quickly are people going to be looking to buy luxury items? And if they were postponing engagement rings are probably our biggest source of revenue and in turn, not just dollar amount, but in number of sales. So as long as people still want to get engaged, I guess we're okay. But it depends if they're putting off that big purchase or not, you know, if they have confidence to do it. We have a little bit of an online presence, but not enough to really sustain us, at least at this point.
Okay.
Diana, tell Dave about your business.
Hi, Dave. How are you?
Hi, Diana.
So I have an energy management company, and we have an online platform that we sell that pulls energy data in from energy invoices for real estate portfolios, hospitals, you know, any type of real estate. And we have direct sales, and then we have partner sales, and our partner sales have actually been continuing. We have some large partners. They've got clients. That's been working out quite well. We're still getting leads. People still moving forward. The direct sales seem to be slowing down more. You know, depending on the industry, you know, it's just not needed, and people are focused on other things. We have, however, been really focused on marketing. And what we're finding, which is really interesting, is that we are doing webinars, I'd say once a month, and that's where we get a lot of our leads from. And we're getting more and more people who are coming onto the webinars and staying for the full time. We also have been adding a lot of leads to the top of the funnel. So we're getting a lot of leads in. I think the issue is, you know, depending on the industry and depending on the company, are they really ready to start transacting? And we have a long sales cycle as it is. It's like 6 to 12 months.
Okay.
And Dan, welcome. Do you want to tell Dave about your business?
Sure. Hi, Dave. Also go for a mechanical firm. We do different build types, so everything from office build, educational, and diversity's helped us a lot lately, but we can only do so much. We're working fully remotely now, which was not, we already had a lot of infrastructure, do a lot of work from home. Our big problem that we can't avoid now is our work is construction related. Until construction at this very reduced new work. So in about 60 seconds, that's who we are.
Okay, good, good.
And hi, Rick, welcome. Could you tell Dave a bit about your business?
Sure. I'm the CTO of a company that does anti-money laundering for banks. It's regulatory compliance. Our customers are like the biggest banks in the world, and we integrate directly with their systems like software as a service. So far, hasn't really hurt business too much. Some projects are getting delayed, but the team is actually kind of overwhelmed with work, so hasn't been too big.
That's a good thing.
And Terry.
Hi.
Morning.
Good morning. I am an acting teacher and an acting coach to professional actors. So the coaching business is at a standstill because Hollywood's at a standstill. And I had a lot of projects that were happening there that just stopped. And then I also have a school in Brooklyn with about 120 students, and that's my main business. And we were able to move most of our classes online. But that's coming to an end in the next month or so. And so what we're really struggling with is new enrollments for the summer and for the fall, because our work really happens, in a physical space together. And it was a little easier to get people who I'd already met and worked with in person to make the transition, but getting new customers, the searches for what we do on Google are down 70% because people are not thinking right now, let me go to New York and do an acting class, or even let me do an acting class from wherever I am right now, just because I think people are so anxious. So, and I'm especially worried about the fall because I just heard recently that universities are now thinking about being online in the fall.
Yeah, we're going to get into my talk here, but that's how I see it too. So I'm going to lay out the why and some numbers. Yeah. And while that might not be a good message, if we understand that, we can start to design towards it, best we can right now. So yeah. I hope to give you an accurate picture, or at least some scenarios of what the fall looks like.
Thank you. Okay.
And Dave, we have 3 more just before we start. Michael, tell Dave about your business.
So I am the managing director and owner of a theatrical costume shop. So we fabricate costumes for Broadway, television, movies, and all, different cultural events. So obviously everything is shut down. We're in a freeze. Everybody is furloughed, and we're sort of in a wait and see, because clearly everything is shut down production wise.
Okay.
Thank you. And Adrian. Adrian, are you on the audio?
Hi, yes. Good morning.
Good morning.
Hi, Adrian. Gerstein Fisher, People's United Advisors. We're a financial advisory firm. And right now, with the markets being volatile, there's been a lot of communications with our clients and talks with them. We just actually had a market outlook call this morning. And we're part of a mid-sized bank. And, right now what we're working on is really strengthening, because a lot of our future leads, not only coming from our existing clients, but also through our partners within our broader or parent firm, the banking organization. So right now we're focusing on working on strategies sort of when things open up, how we can maximize that new business.
Okay.
Thank you. And welcome, Brenda. Tell Dave a bit about your company.
Hi, David. My name is Brenda Levis. I have a relocation company helping mostly expatriates and their families relocate to the United States from other countries, and we help them to settle in here in the United States. So we're a little bit challenged with the borders being closed, and we're looking forward to domestic moves starting up again once New York opens up, and we're working on strategy right now and different methods of handling our services, such as virtual tours. And we've been busy providing emotional support, connecting our community together right now while they're in isolation.
Thank you. So that's who we have so far, Dave. And everyone, let me tell you just a bit about Dave. He's been Vistage Speaker of the Year. He's been a Vistage Speaker for 17 years and a Vistage member for the same amount of time. And he gives about 100 Vistage meetings, CEO and Key, every month. And that's what
Every year,
that's
just to be
every
clear.
year.
Once a year.
Okay.
100 a month, even virtual might kill me.
Okay. You're not going to let me exaggerate. I thought I saw that in LinkedIn. Okay. So Dave, we're so thrilled to have you. Everyone, he's doing this for us pro bono. He is booked to talk to my other Key group, and he offered to do your group and the CEO group gratis. So thank you again, Dave, and we are all yours.
All right, excellent. And I invite you to ask questions as we go. In general, good practice is to keep yourself muted. There's a neat trick with Zoom. If you're muted, you can hold down your space bar to talk, sort of like a walkie-talkie. If you press it right now, you see how it unmutes you. So feel free to use that trick. But in general, I would recommend keeping yourself muted. It keeps the bridge quiet. I am doing this really for two reasons. First of all, you have an awesome chair. And number two, I think this is really important information. Even if I'm not being paid, I want to share it. So let's go. All of the slides, and I noticed that Norma was recording this, but all of the slides are available. And so if you go to this URL, this is a branded short link that we use in social media world. Lowercase, please. You will find Keynote files if you're an Apple person, PowerPoint files if you're a Windows person, PDF if you don't need the animations and builds, and a few other resources. And you'll notice I did not put a copyright on this. Feel free to use this as your own. I use non-copyrighted images here, and I think that you might want to take some of this and share it with other people in your, I'll call it ecosystem, because it might be family, company, customers, as you like. So these slides are now yours, no permission, no attribution needed. We're going to cover the blue part of the directory of topics today. 2 hours. We'll take one break about 55 minutes in. Good practice not to run a video conference for more than an hour straight without a break. I did include a bunch of slides on Zoom tutorial. You might want to check the one that's a checklist, the 10 things you need to know when you're the host. You can also use the tutorial for training other people in a desktop sharing mode. It's built to do that. I also included 4 slides on setting expectations, why the internet is so glitchy. I spent 16 years working on the core technology of telecom and internet infrastructure, and it will help you understand at least a little bit about what's what and why. Daniel, just quick observation, you are apparently not getting enough upstream bandwidth. There's either competition within your home or somewhere in the neighborhood. I would recommend maybe calling your cable company or your internet company and seeing if you can upgrade upstream, because this is going to be important for a while. I also want to point out that when you do have video problems, usually that's okay because we're pretty tolerant of little video glitches. The audio glitch though, is much harder to overcome. So as Daniel was talking, you notice we're losing syllables and getting various artifacts. When that happens, a good workaround is to keep your Zoom screen up with the video sharing and the desktop sharing, but do a dial-in directly. The telecom network works differently than the internet, and you might have noticed when the two folks on the phone, but not on internet audio, introduce themselves, how clear those connections sound. So you can always operate sort of in a hybrid mode. In any case, slides 17 through 20 explain a little bit of that, and I just think expectation setting is a good idea. Over on the right-hand side, we're not going to cover any of that today, but I think that some of the technology like Splashtop or Slack or Teams, particularly important. Self-care, this is a stressful time for everybody. We can't get to our health club, one of my favorite apps in the world. Been using it since 2013 when I read about it in the well section of the New York Times, is the 7 app. It requires no equipment. Everything is just body weight oriented, and it's high intensity interval training. If you've got 7 minutes, you can do a cycle. And so that's really valuable, but we're not going to go there today. I'm going to start actually right at the end of the blue block, the visioning process, slide 94. And I want to talk first about exponentials, because we're going to get into this virus a lot. It's an exponential. And normally, if I were doing this talk and we didn't have this virus, I would be taking you through all the other technology exponentials that are hitting your business in the next 5 to 10 years. And so I guess if there's a good thing, there are a few good things that'll come out of this, but one of them is that our brains will start to understand exponentials a lot better. Now, I want to show you what an exponential looks like, and this is a real example. So we're jumping back in time right now to the year 1975. Kodak engineer Steve Sasson was invited to present to the board the world's first digital camera. This thing was a wonder. It could capture a photograph in a short 23 seconds. It used state-of-the-art storage, that cassette tape you see on the side, and it rendered an amazing 1/100th of 1 megapixel, or 0.01 megapixels. One of the board members, though, asked an interesting question. He asked Steve, how long till this is as good as film? Now, unfortunately, the board didn't understand exponentials, and so I think they went in the wrong direction, but Steve did. And so here's the math he's doing in his mind, and the mistake sometimes people make with exponentials. And so he's going through the math. Now, he knows 2 things. Number one, he's decided that about 2 megapixels, consumers will accept this technology. This is a linear graph, so it would have to be 10 times higher to see where 2 megapixels land. And he knew that his doubling time for pixel density would be about 2 years. In other words, from 1975 to 77, he could get from 0.01 to 0.02. So he's doing the math, and he's doing it in his head, and he says to the board, well, let's see, in about 8 years, I think I could get to 0.16 megapixels. Now, to the board, they're thinking, wow, you didn't even get 1/10 of the way to the destination, and it's 8 years. We're all not only going to be retired, but dead before this thing reaches consumer technology, because you got to go 10 times further. But exponentials don't work like that. So now I'm going to rescale it just to show you what that first 8 years looks like. And what Steve ultimately said to the board was, I think I can get there by roughly 1990, because he understood how exponential curves bend. Kodak chose, for whatever reason, either because they feared that the investment would be too slow to pay off, or they aren't 15-year thinkers, but they chose not to pursue the digital camera, and the world's most valuable brand was bankrupt by 2012. Now, let's not make that mistake. And in fact, I want to start off by giving you a process to use with any horizon. Now, we normally in this talk would do a 5 to 10 year horizon. So we're going to leave 2020 and go to the year 2025 and do a short exercise together with the 5-year horizon. But I want to suggest after today that you use this process with your team, maybe just with a 1-week horizon, or 1 month, or 1 quarter, or maybe the second half of 2020. It doesn't matter what the horizon is. The process will help you develop a shared vision and ultimately anticipate and respond to threats and opportunities. So it's a simple 3-step process. I call this the vision innovation exercise. You start off with your team without being too critical or judgmental, brainstorming, as it were, about possible things that could happen in the time frame of the horizon that you set. And so you're just brainstorming. Now, after you get a list, you look at that list and you decide which of these are the most important. Pick those one at a time and have a different discussion. You assume that that thing has actually come to pass on the date, and then you talk about, okay, it's that date, these things have happened, let's talk about the implications. And when you have a group of people together, it's really interesting to see none of us is as smart as all of us. One suggestion inspires the next. And ultimately, as you start to appreciate the implications of that scenario, you can start to see new opportunities and pick the best to pursue. So let's spend a short amount of time doing one of these, and then you can take the basic process back to your team. And so I'm coming to you right now from Pittsburgh. This is the worldwide headquarters of autonomous vehicle research. 3.5 years ago, Pittsburgh government authorities agreed that they would allow Uber to do live testing on the streets of Pittsburgh with their vehicles under 2 conditions. Number 1, rides had to be free to passengers, and number 2, they had to keep a human in the vehicle to intervene if the software was not acting properly. So for 3.5 years, we've had autonomous Ubers in Pittsburgh. 4 other companies have come to town. All of this comes out of the research being done at Carnegie Mellon University, and so we have dozens of these vehicles. I think, based on what we're seeing here, that in about 5 years, the year 2025, these things will be pervasive. And so let's work that scenario. So jump in our time machines. It's now 2025. If you look out your window, you'll see these autonomous vehicles everywhere. They tend not to park in the high density areas, and so you're not going to see a lot of parking or a lot of parking garages, but these vehicles are moving around out there. So if that's the scenario, unmute yourself and share with me one implication. Major metropolitan areas all over the country, autonomous vehicles, give me an implication.
People don't keep cars anymore, maybe.
Right, exactly. It's just way cheaper to not own a car when I can schedule what I want, when I want, where I want. But then you start to think about the implications on that and like, what happened to the car dealers, right? They're probably gone. Give me another implication.
People are not getting driver's licenses.
That's true. We don't need to get a driver's license, nor are we limited based on our young age or our old age and our ability perhaps to get from point A to point B. So more mobility at the edges of the age spectrum. That's sort of cool. Looking forward to that. Another implication?
People don't go on long driving vacations.
Yeah, probably you don't go on a long driving vacation. If you go on a long drive, it's probably because you scheduled a sleeper car and you climbed in New York and woke up in, say, Chicago. And maybe it wasn't 16 hours later because these cars move faster than, say, 60 miles an hour, maybe at night. Other implications?
Huge unemployment.
Yeah, this is the #1 job for men in this country, driving something. And the economics are so compelling to get the driver out of the system for 2 reasons. Number 1, the driver is expensive. And number 2, for whatever reason, humans like to sleep and they won't drive 24 hours a day, but an autonomous vehicle will. And so we can get better capital, asset utilization out of our vehicles. Oh, by the way, far fewer accidents. Big rigs cause 5% of the accidents, 9% of the fatalities. And so we get the human out of the system, not only better capital utilization, but lower insurance rates, lower transportation costs, lower shipping costs all around. This is a win. Any other implications you see?
In a dense city area like New York, there's going to be more quiet, pleasant areas for walking for pedestrians.
Yeah, so here's the thing. These vehicles don't need to park, and so we don't need parking garages anymore. Currently, the constructors, builders of parking garages have shifted design. They're no longer using parking garages with sloped decks. They're only building flat decks by and large with spirals on the end. You can demo the spiral and repurpose a flat deck to residential or commercial applications. All that on-street parking goes away. So in most cities, probably Manhattan too, 1/3 of the street capacity is parking, and these vehicles can move to resting areas outside of high density areas. Oh, by the way, when we build residential high rises in the cities, we don't have to account for parking anymore. So we get some cost efficiencies there. And by the way, since people are productive as soon as they're in their car, they might choose not to live so close to work because, frankly, even if you're 90 minutes ride from work, you could be working 90 minutes both directions. And so we're going to have cost pressure come out of the cities as people move to less expensive areas to live. Other thoughts? What happens to insurance rates here? And so you got to wonder, Geico, State Farm, Progressive, companies that have, you know, massive revenue streams from auto insurance. First of all, these aren't anymore mostly individually owned vehicles. They're probably fleet ownership, maybe self-insured. They have relatively few accidents anyway. How does State Farm or Geico or Progressive reconcile their cost structure when a huge part of their revenues disappears? You know, our cars are utilized about 2 to 4% of the time across the good old US of A. With these autonomous vehicles, is it possible we might drive utilization up to, say, 20%? That doesn't seem extreme. Mm-hmm. But if it's 20% compared to, say, 4%, which was a high estimate anyway, you need only 1/5 as many vehicles. So what's going to happen to Detroit? When they're selling 1/5 as many vehicles, yeah, carnage. And so if you are anywhere close to the ecosystem that is the auto manufacturing business, that's going to be a really unpleasant place to be because the pain from there is going to flow downhill.
Mm-hmm. How about, Dave, how about some of the cars become moving offices and conference rooms?
Exactly, or exercise vehicles or sleeping vehicles. And so there's a lot of possible changes. But as you start to envision this world, you also start to see there are new possibilities, new opportunities. Somebody's got to service these fleets, right? If I own a car, it'll be a Tesla Model 3, and I'm going to put it into the fleet when I'm not using it. And the total cost of ownership of that thing is going to be lower than any vehicle that exists today. But when it comes back to me, I want it to be, you know, spotless and sterile. Somebody's going to provide those services. And so new opportunities. And so that's the basic process. And so you brainstorm some scenarios, pick the ones that are most interesting to explore further, assume they're true, talk about the implications, and then starts to point you towards the new opportunities. So after today, I'm going to suggest that maybe with a core part of your team, since we're all in this kind of place we've never been before, pick whatever your target date is, week, month, quarter, year. Your business has made it through. That's a fair assumption. Some of your competitors are gone. That's a good thing. Some of your customers are gone. Bad thing. Maybe not all of your employees stayed with you through this process. What else goes on that list? Get the scenario and then talk about the implications. And I think it will help you make better decisions, better resource allocations, better investments. That's the basic idea. All right, so there's the process. We're going to leave that behind and go forward, but any questions or comments before we go forward? Again, a good best practice when you're doing a video conference is to pause and allow people to jump in. You can also either virtually or physically raise your hand, and I'll pause, or you can chat. I won't read the chats real time, but I will pause every once in a while to take a look at what's been chatted. All right. With that, let's get into where we are today. Now, a few disclosures. As I go through this, I'll tell you I've been complimented on delivering a nice apolitical view, but just in case you're wondering about my politics, I am a registered Republican, so don't wonder. Now you know, but I'm not going to try to live there. Number two, we're going to talk about known cases of COVID-19. There are far more actual cases. We don't really know what that ratio is yet. So I'm going to work on the data of known cases. What I will say is our testing coverage in this country hasn't really changed substantially for the better or worse relative to the number of known cases. And so I don't think that the conclusions are skewed by the difference. I think it's relative, the same proportion more or less, but just to be clear, we don't know actual cases. And then if you hate numbers and graphs, just get ready to do my speaker rating as a 111, or maybe I'll ask for just a little bit more forbearance as we go through this. So let's just get to the core conclusion. I have concluded that with high probability during the remainder of the year 2020, now I want to point out some things. This is my conclusion. I don't want you to just take my conclusion and just go believe it at face value. Instead, I'm going to take you on a tour of the data that I've looked at. I'm going to run some Excel numbers for you. I'm going to show you a new chart, new type of chart you've probably never seen. It's called logarithmic graph. Some people have said it's the most valuable thing they learned in this session. And so I have concluded, but ultimately I want you to draw your own conclusion based on the data. And I also say, with high probability, if you're going to try to build a model of the future, there is no 100%. So it's very possible that I'm wrong. If I'm wrong, I'm going to be the happiest idiot alive. So with those caveats, I have concluded that with high probability during the remainder of 2020, oh wait, there are 5 key assumptions that underlie this as well. So I'm going to take you through those assumptions. I would suggest that you probably want to print out that one slide and watch for any of those things changing. You probably have no control, and humans have no control over number 1 or number 2. 3 relates to vaccines. That's probably going to take a year. 4 is one you can probably control. And, well, we'll see about 5. Now, we'll get into those later, but here's my conclusion based on everything I've looked at. Kids are not going to return to traditional K-12 classrooms in the fall. College students are not going to return to traditional campuses in the fall. Traditional childcare centers are not going to be open during the remainder of this year. Stadium bands aren't going to be touring. I think the NFL is going to find a way to play because we want to be entertained, even if we're, not in the stadiums. If there are people in the stadiums, they're probably something like 10% capacity. There won't be any traditional campaign rallies. Traditional restaurants and bars are not going to serve many or maybe any patrons inside, which is not to say there's no restaurant business, but you just don't have patrons inside, or not very many. Broadway's not going to reopen, at least not in the current theaters. Weddings and funerals will continue, but are going to be sort of small affairs. Airlines are not going to use their center seats unless, of course, something like everybody's wearing N95 masks. Movie theaters won't be open. In-home childcare is going to be a growth industry. And I think a lot of people are going to come away with valuable new technology habits that are going to serve our business as well on the other side. Now, before we go further, there is one common underlying element to every item in this list. Do you see what it is? The underlying element, the underlying belief.
That it's dangerous to be in crowds?
Yep, that's it. Dangerous to be in crowds. And so all of these things represent relatively high density groupings of humans, and I don't see it happening, and here's why. So let's look at 78 days, which would have been up to April 6th with SARS-CoV-2 among us. That's the virus that causes COVID-19. And so you start with one case in one state, that being Washington. Later, by the way, we did have a second entry point, good old New York, coming not from China like Washington, but from Europeans. We know that now because we've been able to do genomic testing on the RNA. And the thing about viruses is they reproduce really well, but not very accurately or reliably. And so we're already seeing mutations that allows us to track these things. But in any case, it came to New York a bit after it came to Washington, and those were our 2 entry points. So you start with one case in one state, you implement serious social distancing after you let this thing run free for 60 days. By the way, 60 days on the chart, March 20th, you can just barely see this thing starting to show up in linear form, which is why we're going to look at this in a different form. And we end up with 365,000 cases. Now, we got to watch this thing run free before that and measure the doubling time. And here's the thing. If I show you what this looks like without having implemented serious social distancing after 60 days, there's your chart. Sort of looks the same, doesn't it? Except that it's 6.5 million instead of 365,000. So as we look around the world or any city or any state, two things vary. The starting date there might vary, and depending on the density and intermixing of humans, the doubling time varies. So we see those things vary, but the basic pattern of this thing acting as an exponential, doubling at whatever period, same everywhere. And so we'll look at this, the actual data in a minute. I do talk in this talk normally about a lot of exponentials, and so we're going to come back in some point in the future and take a deeper look at the next 5 to 10 years. The amount of information on our phones is doubling annually. There's an exponential, and there's a lot of implications of that, but that's a topic for a different day. Okay, so 365,000, back to reality. And I think we should be maybe generous in forgiving humans that they don't quite get exponentials. See, because here's the math. This thing took 67 days before we had 100,000 known cases. We have roughly a 2% mortality rate. So 100,000 times 2%, there's been 2,000 deaths, more or less. And, you know, we have a lot more people than that die from the flu. What's the big deal? More people than that die from auto accidents. What's the big deal? Well, the big deal is the tyranny of exponentials is illustrated if you move just a little further down the curve. And at this point, we're trying to slow the thing down. We're getting 100,000 cases in 3.3 days. And without intervention, that just keeps accelerating upwards. And so trying to compare COVID to every other thing we've got, I've seen that mistake way too many times. So mission number one, flatten the curve. Don't overwhelm the healthcare system. I'm happy to report New York is past peak. Most places never went past their hospital bed capacity. New York, New Jersey did, but most places didn't, and they've gotten to the other side. So by and large, we have passed the peak, and now we got to go down the other side of the curve, and I'm going to show you how long I think that's going to be. But here's the question. So let's get down the other side of the curve, and then let's just go back to the good old-fashioned normal that we were in. So let's go back to the bars and back to the NFL stadiums. This time, what you would do is you'd restart the exponential, but not with one case in one state, but many cases in all 50 states. And you got to ask yourself this. What would cause SARS-CoV-2 to behave any differently the second time? And the answer is lacking some things like a vaccine or herd immunity approaching 90%, which we're not going to be anywhere close to. You don't even want to do the math of 90% of the population times the 2% death rate. The virus just isn't going to be any different. And so there isn't going to be a hard end to this thing this year. And again, I will lay out my 5 things to watch for, but that is my basic assumption. No hard end, can't go back to the old normal. And so what does that imply for businesses? And so here are the 3 things I think that you should be working on immediately. There's no reason to wait on any of this if there's not a hard end. So we now have to look at the business processes and redesign. The reason those letters look backwards is because we're inside your business now looking out. And you redesign your business to achieve 3 things. Number 1, we're going to need to achieve virtually flawless social distancing within the business. That means people don't come within 6 feet of each other. Now, if you have a business where that's impossible, I want to point out there are some other ways to achieve social distancing that don't require distance. For example, 2 people can be an inch apart, and if there's a plexiglass barrier between them, you've achieved social distancing or the equivalent. If 2 people are an inch apart and they're both wearing N95 masks, the great thing about an N95 mask is not only does it, if I am a carrier, reduce or stop propagation, if I am with somebody who's a carrier, it stops the acquisition. So if we both have masks on, we're both pretty safe. And so virtually flawless social distancing. How do we do that in the business? Let's figure that out today so we can be back into operation as soon as possible. Number 2, this thing is really good at moving between humans using common surfaces. So I'm going to show you New England Journal of Medicine, but if you've got a piece of plastic or you've got a piece of stainless steel, the SARS-CoV-2 virus is viable on that for at least 3 days. And so 2 people can't touch the same surface. So when you think about the business, how are we solving problems of, maybe we get rid of the break room and everyone can have a Keurig in their own little 6x6 space. but what about the bathrooms? What about the other places people have to be? What about if we have to be in elevators? And so we're going to have to deal with surface transmission for a while. And then number three, a lot of our employees presumably will be still work at home. I can guarantee you the number one way to lower an employee's productivity is to put their kids in their home. And so I think we're going to have to start talking to employees and maybe even funding some creation of special spaces in their home. And maybe if it's a two-parent home, we talk to them about making an agreement with their spouse about, kid handoff so that they can each be productive during certain periods of time. Maybe for some particularly key employees, we think about underwriting in-home childcare so that they can be productive and somebody else can watch the kids. But I think for the rest of the year, we got to be careful about that productivity killer. So again, I want to pause and just ask for your thoughts or comments. What would be different with the virus? Nothing. There is no definitive end to this year. And so let's get down to business. Let's figure out these three things. Let's redesign the business processes and be ready to go as soon as we're allowed to go.
I got a question, Dave. You mentioned getting closer to herd immunity, and we're not going to be near that. Being that New York was one of the first and hardest hit places, could you see maybe more widespread, and because there's no ability to test, I don't know that there would be any way to benefit from this, but is there a possibility that the actual cases in New York is in fact much greater than the known cases?
Very possible.
We have a more substantial level of immunity already than we might know about. Obviously, if we can't test for it, it's useless information anyway.
Well, I think we're going to be able to test within a relatively near-term horizon. Might not be next week, maybe not even next month, but I'd be really surprised if we make it through, a quarter without being able to do substantial testing. Just want to point out one of the things that South Korea did right. They had the same first date of first case, January 20, as the US. Within 2 weeks, they were producing 100,000 test kits per day. 100,000 per day. So we're going to get there even though we stumbled out of the starting gate. So I think eventually we can start to explore that. And so I've got a lot of thoughts on it, but the first thing, just for all of you to keep in mind, if you have employees that had COVID, those people are probably immune. And as such, they will be able to play a role in your business. The interfaces in the business that would be dangerous for the rest of us, that's an interesting point, because if you've got immunity, you don't have it to transmit and you can't acquire it from somebody. And so make note of that. That's going to be a new way you're going to want to sort employees going forward. Daniel, to your point, one of the things that might be the case is there are far more people out there that have this than we realize. And if that's true, then you've got a broad part of the population that was exposed, which was a good thing. And here's the question. There is some developing science right now, and this is not definitive yet, but that says if you did not have symptoms, you may be able to acquire the disease a second time. It's only if you had pretty significant symptoms and really developed serious antibodies to this thing that you might be immune. And so I think ultimately we're going to need more science and some antibody level testing probably. Right now that looks like a blood test. So we'll see. But two things to think about. So I looked at the New York City numbers comparing when, as we were starting to social distance, did we get to a 2-day doubling time in New York? Because you were at 1 day doubling at one point. When did we get to 2-day doubling of known cases? And then when did we get to 2-day doubling on deaths? And of course, there's a lag, but presumably that's a pretty constant time lag for any particular doubling time. And when you look at that difference, if the mortality rate is 2%, my back of the envelope math says in New York City, 13 times more people have this than we know. I've seen estimates between 10 and 50. And again, that's super unscientific right there, back of the envelope, but We're going to find out. There was a really interesting piece of news that hit this morning. We, from the CDC 2 weeks ago today, learned that they believed that 25% of people that have COVID are completely asymptomatic. Remember this aircraft carrier where the disease broke out? We just finished testing almost all of the sailors on that aircraft carrier, and fully 60% of them that have COVID had no symptoms. And so it may turn out to be the case. And it's sort of mixed, because at one level it says maybe there's the potential for more immunity than we thought. We don't know if that effect is true if you're asymptomatic, but on the other hand, we might have a lot more carriers than we thought, can't detect them. You know, this is where, well, we're going to see. So that's a key question, complicated science there, and we're learning more. There's also a parallel study going on the 8,000 residents of Telluride, Colorado. You know, that's a really great petri dish, because there's only 8,000 residents, and yet they hosted, as a ski resort, the world's population for December, January, February, and most of March before we stopped skiing. And so they're testing all residents there. And so more science is going to come out on this, and that should help us know. By the way, I don't think there's a human on the planet that has spent more time looking at viruses and pandemics. And, you know, Bill Gates' personal quest is to try to stamp out polio on the planet. So like smallpox, it just doesn't exist. It's gone and is a thing of the past. Here's his observation. This came out 1 week ago, Friday, when Bill Gates thinks the pandemic will end. And he says, if all necessary interventions are imposed, and I guess that's a pretty important caveat, but if all necessary interventions are imposed, Gates posits that things won't return to quote unquote normal until the fall of 2021. And so the point of sharing this kind of information is just to start to build some models. And I'm going to encourage everybody to at least do a what if, what would be the implications if, and then get down to redesigning the business to get back to as much normal business in the new normal as possible. Let me show you what I think is a great example. Norma, do you have a question, or just stretching there? Still got you muted. Spacebar.
Mute.
Perfect.
Yeah, no question.
Okay, cool. All right, so again, just signal me with a hand or virtual hand raise or a chat if you do have a question. So let's talk about business process redesign. And I think that this has to be one of the hardest examples. How do you do this in retail? And I think Costco is our best model. And so I took this picture 3 weeks ago, Thursday, when I was in Costco, and I want to talk about some of what they've done to adapt. By the way, I didn't take this picture of this guy you see sort of front and left there to be critical, but, you know, looking now at what he's buying, you know, 5 cases of water, a mega case of bath tissue, some plastic bags, and enough food to get till tomorrow. That guy's going to starve to death before he's used 2 rolls of toilet paper. It's interesting what priorities we go after. Now, here is the business process redesign. If you've not been a Costco member to this point in time, first of all, it's an unbelievable operation. It doesn't normally look like what you're seeing there. Normally, those lines are all full, packed front to back, you know, 7 to 8 carts, nose to tail, every single one. It's a madhouse, although they're really fast at processing at checkout, and so their throughput is pretty incredible. But in this pandemic, they have chosen to close all but one entrance and all but one exit because they want to manage the in-store load. And so they've got an employee with a clicker at the entrance and the expert at the exit, and they are comparing numbers, and they have some load whenever incoming exceeds exiting by a certain amount, then they go to socially distanced exterior queuing. So what does that look like? So let's move outside the store and then we'll come back in. Materials on hand. We got lots of pallets. So you stack up the pallets to create the line. You grab a can of spray paint from Home Depot across the street and a tape measure and just mark out every 6 feet. And so once the store hits capacity, they queue, and then for each person exiting, you can release one person from the queue. Brilliant. In-store load, so we're not too crowded, so the rest of us can socially distance. Next, new surface management processes. And so let me just mention 2. There's a lot of them, but the 2 that you'll notice real quick as a consumer Everybody who is a member of Costco has a plastic membership card. The process up until about 4 weeks ago was you hand that membership card to your checkout clerk, and once the whole transaction is done and paid for, you get the plastic card back. The problem is plastic is a transmission media. There is no handoff of the card anymore. In addition, at the exit of Costco, every person has to present their receipt and have it marked so receipts can't be used. They're controlling shrink and human misbehavior. Well, in a pandemic, you know what? We're not going to worry about that. So there is no handoff of that paper at exit anymore, because even paper is a transmission media. So new surface management procedures. Okay, so you can see the social distancing happening in the queue here with the yellow lines on the floor. But how do you social distance as you approach that clerk, the checkout person? Here's how. A little bit hard to see the plexiglass, so I'm just going to highlight the outline of it. And so you can see they've created plexiglass structures so that even though I approach, because of the previous store design, within 6 feet of her, we are socially distanced. And I'm pretty sure when I go back to Costco next Thursday, assuming availability, she won't look like that. She'll have a mask on, and so will all the other coworkers in Costco. I don't know where it is in New York, but in Pennsylvania, businesses are now under order not to allow people in without at least improvised masks. Improvised masks probably do little to protect the wearer, but they do a little bit to reduce propagation. And so it is one more measure lacking N95 or better grade masks that we can use to achieve a slowing of this thing. By the way, I'm going to show you what great progress that we are making in our social distancing. Huge progress in the, roughly 21 days we've been at this. Okay, so my philosophy is this: prepare for the worst without over-investing, mind you. So we got to be cautious. We reuse existing materials like pallets that are round back instead of, constructing fancy queues that are covered. Presumably customers, if it's raining, they'll bring their own umbrellas. We can make it work. So we don't overinvest. And then if this turns out not to be quite what we thought it was, well, we're going to be thankful that it didn't come to pass. But I'll tell you, a lot of people out there, like Bain and Company, says this has the potential to be a 100-year event. Not as in 100 years long, but like a 100-year flood. This is the big one. So again, I'll pause. We have 13 participants at this point. Questions or comments? I'm going to take you into next a little bit of history. What did we learn from 1918? Because we did have a pandemic sort of like this back then. And then I'm going to take you into the numbers so that ultimately you can create your own beliefs about this thing.
Can you explain what you mean by that last thing, 100-year flood as opposed to 100-year event?
Yeah, the term 100-year flood means something that is so big you would expect it to come only once every 100 years. It's a very big but very rare event. And this is what we're dealing with, this thing. This is the big one, and it's something that happens rarely, but this is the big one. That's really what that idiom, I think, means. I think we'll be, certainly by 2 years, probably 1 year, we'll have a vaccine. That's the binary switch on this thing. Once we can vaccinate a large portion of our population, this will be less of an issue, in part because the people vaccinated presumably will be protected, but then they also don't become propagators, and so the virus just has a much harder time propagating. By the way, where does herd immunity, how many people have to get this to reach that? Just something a thought experiment to consider. So, the flu rages through our population every year, and that's when you have about 2/3 of the people vaccinated. So 67% isn't a high enough number to slow down the flu, and COVID-19 is 3 times more contagious than the flu. So we don't know the number right now, but my guess is you got to be up somewhere, probably north of 90% because of how transmissible this is and the fact that even people without symptoms can transmit. And so I don't see us getting anywhere near herd immunity. It could happen in a business. Right now we got the pork processing plants in South Dakota at Smithfield Field shut down, right? So many members got it. They will get through it over the course of the next couple of weeks. And then, that plant's going to be in operation, and maybe there you have herd immunity. But for the U.S. population broadly, not too likely. So I'm looking at the clock, and like I said, you probably shouldn't run these video conferences for more than about 55 minutes without a 10-minute break. I think that's a good best practice. So any questions or comments before we go to break? I'm going to take you into history next and sort of the near-term long view. Go ahead, Daniel.
I just have one more comment on the 100-year event, which we deal with those kinds of metrics in terms of on an engineering basis, in terms of when is, this is a 10-year rainfall or a 50-year storm or a 100-year storm that we designed for, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which, you have to think of it in a different kind of way than this happens every 100 years, because that's not the case. 100 years is longer than your lifetime. So a 100-year event just happened. Oh, well, I'm good for the rest of my life. That's not the case at all. We had Hurricane Irene and Hurricane Sandy within 3 years. They were both 100-year storms. So
Right.
100-year storm to me means nothing anymore.
All right.
And, like that's all based on data looking backward. So I think the hurricane, I think hurricanes are a good analogy, because if you look at data going back 100 years, it's not necessarily taking into account current, recent, future trends that might impact that, the likelihood, right? Just like COVID as a 100-year event, if you're looking at the Spanish flu was the last time we had this kind of, a pandemic, that doesn't take in, okay, it's been 100 years, but this is a global society now that's completely enmeshed with each other, that's much more likely to experience that kind of thing.
I agree with you 100%. We have far higher density now than we did in 1918. A lot more people live in cities as opposed to, on farms and agriculture. We have a global transportation system, global supply chain. And I'll tell you personally, I was talking to Norma about this ahead of time. That picture that we opened with, that was my N100 mask, which is way better than N95. And I've stocked these things for the last 20 years because I consider pandemics almost inevitable in our lifetime. And so I will not be surprised if this occurs again. And even just this century. Remember when SARS almost got out? Remember when MERS almost got out? Remember when Ebola almost got out? And this one got out. And so these viruses mutate very quickly. There's more opportunities for intermixing of animals, and this one's from a bat, but animals and humans. And so I'm with you, Daniel. I don't think past is prologue anymore. And I would suggest after, we're through this, you don't forget about it and you are ready for it when it comes the next time. Because I'm 59. I'm pretty sure there will be a next time before the end of my life, my guess. All right, 10-minute break. And so we'll resume and we'll talk about a little bit of history, 1918 Spanish flu, and we'll look at some numbers. All right, we're ready to roll if everyone else is.
Good.
All right, so let's do some history. So now we're traveling back to 1918. And just another quick caveat, I'm an engineer. In fact, my podcasting handle is The Numbers Guy. Love spreadsheets and numbers and all that kind of stuff. Took a lot of statistics. But just so you know, that's where I come from. I'm not a medical professional, not a psychic, etc. All right, so this is US GDP. My sources are generally listed at the bottom. And you can see going into 1918, GDP was rising nicely. The Great Influenza struck in probably Haskell County, Kansas, best we can tell. The reason it ultimately got named the Spanish flu is because U.S. was at war, so was Europe. Newspapers didn't write about bad stuff. So as influenza ravaged through our populations, it was not reported. Spain was neutral, and so the press was writing about whatever, and we dubbed it the Spanish flu. But it actually started, we think, in Kansas, spread from there by the U.S. military. Best estimate, 50 million deaths. We don't have great records from the non-developed world, so it could have conceivably been 100 million. Again, these are CDC numbers. It was unusually deadly to 20 to 35-year-olds. The stronger your immune system was, the more likely you were to die. This was H1N1, and it triggered in your lungs an immune response that caused what was called a cytokine storm. And ultimately, you didn't want to be in the middle spectrum on this one. Now, different with COVID. COVID-19, although one of the interesting things in terms of history, maybe not echoing, or not repeating, but rhyming or echoing, it appears maybe the most severe cases, the people that actually die of COVID, it is ultimately that same kind of cytokine effect. In any case, 20 to 35, maybe 40-year-olds, 2% global mortality rate. And another weird coincidence, we're dealing with another disease here today that has a 2% mortality rate. At least we think so far. This is a World Health Organization study from China. And of course, they have pretty good testing coverage by the end there. And the CDC has done, the World Health Organization has done some statistical calculation to try to account for confirmed versus all cases. And so in the right-hand column, you see the death rate. While in China, there were no fatalities among the 10 and under set. That's not true anymore globally. It's not very dangerous to that age group, but some have died. And so you can see a pretty clear correlation based on age, mortality rate relative to age. This is more dangerous to males than females, at least based on what we learned from China. Part of it in China is that smoking is very prevalent among males, and so they have more compromised lungs. And so that probably accounts for part of the higher mortality rate. But we think maybe only half of the difference. The other half is probably biological and relates to the fact that females are XX chromosome and males are XY. And that doesn't serve us well in this case. Now, just to consider, because people like to compare this to the flu, and so I'm going to do that for you real quick, and feel free to use these same statistics. 20 times more deadly than the flu. Flu kills about 1/10 of 1% of the population that gets it. This kills 2%. It's 3 times as contagious, according to the CDC. That's best we understand it. And with the flu, we've protected 2/3 of our population, so only 1/3 is at risk. This time, 3/3, all of us are at risk. And so my nickname, and this isn't very scientific, but my nickname for COVID-19 is Flu 180, because it's 20 times more deadly, 3 times more contagious is 60, 3 times larger target population, 180. Not science, but my nickname. Now, I think we're going to have a problem in the relatively near future, so I'm just going to highlight it. I don't know what we're going to do about this as a society, but this thing isn't particularly deadly to you if you are below 40, which is about half our population. And I think compliance is social distancing compliance is going to be a problem looking forward. We'll see. This headline, I thought, put it pretty well. Young and unafraid of the coronavirus pandemic? Good for you. Now stop killing people. It turns out that anybody can be a propagator, even with no symptoms. 2 weeks ago, the CDC said that's perhaps 25% of the population. At least among a younger population, like sailors on an aircraft carrier, it appears to be, at least in that one data point, maybe 60%. So we're trying to get a handle on that number. That's one of the problems, though. People can propagate with no symptoms, and so you feel fine and you go out and you don't socially distance, you're killing people. The first key threat that we saw was the healthcare system becoming overwhelmed, and the models looked really ugly if we didn't intervene. Happily, outside of New York and New Jersey, pretty much everybody avoided exceeding capacity, and we made it through in New York and getting down through in New Jersey. And I'm starting to cross that off my list of things to worry about, at least for this wave. So good. This doctor, I thought, put it pretty well. He says this: we stay at home not for us, but for other people. It is part of our social responsibility as the American or global culture. Now, back to 1918. Weird coincidence that we have a 2% mortality rate. If you want to do the math, just to understand, sometimes people talk about, the cost of the, cure versus the disease. Well, a quick thought experiment for you. If we don't intervene, it looks a lot like 1918. They didn't understand viruses so much back then, and they tended to social distance out of fear, but the fear abated quickly, and they came back together too fast, and boom. 675,000 Americans died. Again, this is CDC data. And today we have 3.3 times more Americans. So not even accounting for what Daniel and I were talking about a minute ago, like the higher densities in cities and the more intermixing back in 1918, like half the population was so distributed on farms, they were never, ever exposed to this thing. So even ignoring that, it's real easy to get north of 2 million. So in terms of the threat, there's just a good summary for you. Now, the other problem in 1918 was the fear abated quickly, and they came back together too quickly. And so when you look at the graphs in terms of deaths per 1,000 people, week by week, you can see that there was a big echo of this thing in the first quarter. And so let's look at GDP. 1918, 1919, last quarter of 1918, first 4 months of 1919 is when this thing was really bad. And so it probably doesn't surprise you to look at the next numbers and see them as going down. And they are. What might surprise you is that the total hit, when we went right at the core of the American workforce, the 20 to 40-year-olds, we dropped 3%. 3% total drop. Now, I got to tell you, I haven't talked to anybody that thinks 3% is like a reasonable number this time. But here's an interesting thought for you to consider. You're probably familiar with Alan and Brian Bolio and their firm ITR. They've done a tremendous amount of work for Vistage members. We've had them in our community for many, many years. They were extremely helpful going through the financial crisis in 2008 and helping us understand the business cycle ABCD. So I got to guest host the Vistage Executive Summit for New England last week. And so we spent one of our hours with one of the ITR economists. Now, I can't put this on my slide because I don't want to steal their intellectual property, but I think it's fair, since I heard this firsthand, as a reporter to you, I can share with you their prediction. I took a screen capture of it, so I'm just reading right off my screen capture what they said to the 250 members of Vistage in New England. They see a recession for first quarter and for second quarter, and then they see the GDP heading back up in the third quarter and the fourth quarter. And by the time we get to the end of the fourth quarter, they're predicting a net, get this, 1.3% drop for the year. So we'll go down more than that, but we'll come back 1.3%. And anyway, looking back at history, oh, by the way, 2.6% growth they're projecting in 2021. And, they already know about the government stimulus, $2 trillion. They know about the potential of a second wave. They're factoring in the second black swan we're dealing with, which is oil prices. We have, an American presidential election. They're smart people. They've run their models, 1.3%. It just feels a lot worse than that right now. But remember, in the 20s, after the downturn, 1922 was a 5% gain in GDP. These are inflation-adjusted dollars. 13% gain in 1923. And we actually have a name for what happened. We call it the Roaring '20s. And so there will be good times on the other side of this, and our challenge, our mission, is to make sure we're there to participate. Now, here's another interesting piece of information from Vistage. I learned it as the MC of the Executive Summit, but you can actually go to the Vistage website now and get this straight off of the website. And I'll give you the link at the end of this slide to get this data. They surveyed Vistage members in early April. And in fact, the study that's posted on the Vistage website is dated April 15th. So it's pretty current. They've been running this survey and the numbers are still the same. 26% of us Vistage members, our revenues are at plan for 2020 as originally envisioned or above. And so there are a chunk of businesses that are benefiting. I would suggest that it would be worth thinking about who those people are and do any of them need your products or services? Because that's about a quarter of the businesses where it's still a relatively sunny day. 44%, the yellow part, have seen a decline which they term as manageable. 1 to 25%, so call that on average 13% down for 44%, almost half of Vistage members, and they've adjusted their business and they're operating going forward. Now I want to point out something about the language that we're using, that the press is using. And I'm not pointing at any particular party. I just want to make sure that we don't fall prey to this. So you look at that chart, we talk about the US economy as being shut down. granted, it's not running at 100%, but it's not shut down either. What that shows is 2/3 of Vistage members have found a path forward, and they're operating not too far, or maybe even a little bit better than planned. So we're not shut down. Okay, so let's just be careful of our language. We're not at zero. That's what shutdown means to me. Now, there are 27% of us Vistage members that took a hit greater than 25%. This is real pain, and we're going to have to figure out how to get to the other side. And so I don't want to minimize it. I don't want to be Pollyanna, but the economy is not shut down. And by the end of this year, I don't know if you know the Bolios or trust them. I would suggest that maybe it's time to get familiar with their services and see what goes into their assumptions and stay current, because new developments could obviously change their projections. But a projection of 1.3% drop in GDP by end of the year, that's a lot better picture than what it feels like right now. There is the link at the bottom of the slide to get the full report off the Vistage website. 2 days ago, you saw the headlines. Retail sales plunge a record 8.7% in March as coronavirus freezes the U.S. economy. Coronavirus delivers a record blow to the U.S. retail sales in March. Auto dealers, clothing stores, shellacked. I guess, again, it depends on how you want to think about this. Our perspective is often colored by us as consumers and our local restaurant and our local hair salon being literally shut down. But a lot of the U.S. economy goes forward. And so 8.7% is definitely not trivial, but the glass is still 91.3% full. And so just be careful of your own beliefs. This is the ITR website, Brian and Alan Bolio's company. And in an interview with Brian on April 3rd, he says this: in terms of the broader market, it's good to see, according to ITR models, GDP begin to lift off the canvas in the third quarter of this year, particularly as consumers not only exit their homes, but that car that they couldn't buy in the second quarter, they're going to buy it in the third quarter. And so here's one more warning. Second quarter is going to be a recession, and it's going to look really bad. In fact, in some ways, artificially bad. And so don't let it overcolor your expectations. Here's why. If you went out and bought 4 years worth of toilet paper in the first quarter, you do not need toilet paper. Well, actually, you need toilet paper, just don't need to buy toilet paper in the second quarter, right? So this advanced buying that happened in Q1 is going to make Q2 look artificially worse. And so to finish the story of history, what were the takeaways? Well, number one key priority, whether it's out of self-interest or interest in your company or interest in American or global society, stay healthy, keep employees healthy, keep your family healthy, help slow the spread of the disease, and beware of the echo, because that often happens with these viruses. If you want to get the whole history, a great book I read about 10 years ago, I think. I've been re-listening to it now on Audible. And what I realized the second time through is the first 8 chapters are a little bit boring, sort of the history of the development of modern medicine. So my recommendation is get the book, skip right to part 3, the Tinderbox, chapter 9, and you'll get a perspective of how these things work. So again, I want to pause for a second before I go on to the next slides. Questions, comments, thoughts? Keep rolling then. Now, we got to see this. Actually, I'll do a quick check on the chat. I don't have the chat live just because it's sort of hard to read and talk. The economic outlook call we held this morning, our economist also said we would have a quick recovery. Yeah, this is going to be, it's not like a recession. I mean, it technically is a recession in terms of GDP dropping, but a lot of the job loss is sort of a artificial temporary thing where employers are planning to go back online and restore those jobs. And so this is probably going to be a sharper V than you would typically see in a recession. So watch for that V and watch for second quarter to be particularly scary. But that will also make third quarter look a little bit better. Now, we got to see how this virus behaves. In New York City, I watched it, and nationally, I watched it. And before you intervene, so let me show you some screenshots. This comes from bing.com/COVID. Microsoft is a bunch of numbers geeks, and they're good at building websites and graphics. and by the way, I check every day to make sure their numbers are consistent with CDC, you know, they're not going to lean very much left or right because they sell to red and blue and they don't want to upset half their customer base. And so to me, they're one of the trusted sources. We have to be very careful with sources right now and double check. And so I've done the double checking. Notice when I took this screenshot on March 20th, and this is before, I mean, New York had just started to go into the social distancing and closing educational institutions and so on at that point in time. Most of the country was later than that. And so we're still seeing the disease by and large unconstrained. By the way, even when you go into the mode at first, it takes a good week for any of the statistics to change because people are exposed and then come down with the disease. So this is a pretty clean look at what does this thing do before you intervene. 14,000 cases. The next day was 20,000. And again, we're just dealing with known data. I already gave you my hand waving about known versus actual. Next day, 27,000. Next day, 35,000. And so on it goes. Now let me take you inside these numbers. Let's look back to March 20 when we had, call it roughly 14,000 cases. Do you notice how 2 days later you have roughly 28,000 cases? Or March 23rd when you have roughly 35,000 cases, and then 2 days later you have roughly 70,000. That is a doubling period of 2 days. Now, even across that whole period, we still only have roughly 70,000 cases. What's the big deal, especially given this 2% mortality rate? Well, here's the big deal with exponentials. We don't have much experience with this, but 10 doublings of an exponential is 100,000% increase. And so you let this thing run cleanly, unimpeded for 20 days, 10 doublings, it's not 14,000, it's 14 million by April 9th. And so that's what we're up against. And so then the next thing I hear, since I talk to people all over the country, is, well, it's too bad for those people in New York, but this virus is really a New York problem. It's not really a big deal anywhere else. Oh yeah? Okay. I'm going to do something that I'm not, Daniel, did you want to jump in or just moving around? Okay, yeah, I'll just move around. I'm sort of bouncing my eyes between the video screen and the slides. So I'm going to do something you're not supposed to do as a statistician. In fact, there's even a name for when you take out the data you don't like to try to prove a point. It's called cherry picking. But I'm going to do it anyway because I think it reveals something interesting. So for all those people that are saying, hey, this is a New York problem, great. I'm going to subtract out New York. We'll take out New Jersey too. Close proximity, they got walloped. And for good measure, this started in Washington and was pretty big in California. So let's take out all 4 states. Now, obviously, I'm going to plot the next line. It's going to be lower because it's for only 46 states, a smaller part of our population. But I think what you'll find amazing is, number one, how close it tracks, and number two, how the shape matches. And in fact, if you look inside this thing, you can see that it takes exactly 6 days, at least last time I ran the data, for 46 states to catch up to all 50. And so this isn't just a New York problem. This behaves the same everywhere. And so this is a everybody problem. So the next question is, how long do we have to do this kind of lockdown thing? Well, we got some data points. In China, they went hard into a lockdown towards the end of January. And so by the end of March, March 23rd, they're announcing that they are going to start to ease restrictions. They didn't drop them entirely. In fact, they still haven't dropped them entirely. But they said this at a 2-month point and 2.5 month point, they really started to relax. And here's the question. Number one, do you believe China's numbers? They just announced yesterday that somehow they had another like 50% people, dead that they figured out. And so they just revised the numbers yesterday. But if you don't, then what you have to conclude is this: a 2.5 month lockdown by a totalitarian regime enforced by arresting people is not enough to get on top of this. And so how long is this likely to be? Well, let's go to Australia. Presumably the researchers at University of Sydney don't have anything out for Republicans versus Democrats. I see nothing political about this study. And what their models show is something interesting here. So they built some models, and then they put in the parameters about how easily this disease is communicated and different severities and some assumptions about asymptomatic transmission. And then they looked at what happens under different levels of compliance with social distancing. If we do a really good job with social distancing, by 3 months, you're at the other side of this curve where you've got a relatively small number of cases. If we're not quite as good, what they call 80% social distancing, which they define as the average member of public going out once every 5 days, so once every 5 days, no masks, that's 80%. That's going to take 4 months. And so if you're doing the math, I count end of March is when this social distancing started in earnest in the US. So if you believe China, it's at least end of May or into June. If you think we're at 90% compliance, then we're talking end of June. If you think it's 80% compliance, or if we get people letting down their guard, and maybe it's end of July. And if you don't achieve 70% compliance, the curve never comes down. Here's their data. And I want to point out two very interesting things. Number one was what they were studying. And if you don't have sufficient social distancing compliance, and remember, half our population under 40, not very threatened by this thing, then it just continues to run through the population and increase. And 80%, 90%, you could look at the numbers there. Now, they were not studying this. They didn't even write about it. But what I noticed on this graph was that eventually, once they got their result, they stopped the suppression period and reported out. But they let their model continue to run. And so what should strike you as you look at the yellow curve on the left and on the right, the shape is exactly the same. And it would be, barring something like herd immunity or a vaccine or continued social distancing. And that says we can't go back to the old normal. Now, happily, I'm going to skip the next 15 slides. This is all about the threat to the healthcare system and what happens if we don't respond fast enough, but we did, by and large. New York got hit harder than anywhere else in the country. What is interesting is you made it through the bed shortage and the ICU shortage. Wasn't pleasant to be in the healthcare system, but you are now 9 days on the other side of peak resource usage. In most of the rest of the country, for example, Illinois, California, I've run these numbers, Texas, by and large, never hit system capacity. I want to point out, the researchers that have built this at healthdata.org have been stating for a long time, assuming social distancing through May 2020. We're not really hearing our public figures talk about that yet, whether they're politicians or public health professionals. I think maybe because they're trying to talk to us about stuff we can do now, and the first challenge was flatten the curve, which we're now accomplishing. And so I wouldn't be the least bit surprised to hear them start to talk about the next phase and a little bit longer term. You can see when facilities closed. Illinois was one of the ones that went right along with New York, and ultimately no bed shortage, 8 days past peak. So I think by and large, we can declare success, at least getting past the top of the curve and not crushing the healthcare system nationally. Great, phase one is done. Now, let's look forward from there. And here is something very interesting that you'll probably want to look at a lot of times after today. This is an exponential series, column A, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32. We're not really familiar with these in business, although this would describe Moore's law and the exponential increase of computer processing power, and why today an Apple Watch on your wrist has more processing power than the fastest supercomputer on the planet 30 years before. That's an exponential. Now, in Excel, check this out. There is an option when you're in your formatting axis to switch from a linear scale to a logarithmic scale. And watch what happens when I click that box. There's only one thing you need to know about what you're looking at. If you see a straight line on a logarithmic graph, that means you've got an exponential that is operating at a fixed doubling time. And that's really bad. Remember, 10 doublings, 1,024, 100,000%. Now, let's look at the same data from China for a second. And I call this our linear brains have trouble grasping exponentials. And by the way, I don't care if you do or don't trust China's numbers. You can run on South Korea, Italy. Now you can even run on the US, which I will in a minute. You'll see the same exact story. So this is more about how to look at and interpret data. If you look at the chart on the left, that is a linear scale, 20, 40, 60, 80, 100. On the right, it's a logarithmic scale or exponential, 100, 1,000, 10,000, 100,000. Now, it's sort of hard to look at the data on the left and be the least bit optimistic about what's going on according to China. On the right, it's a little different. So you see in late January, that straight line pattern, that means that this thing is doubling at a fixed period. You notice if I extend the line after they go into their totalitarian lockdown, how the curve bends forward and to the right. That's good. The doubling time is slowing down. The slope is changing. You cannot see that by looking at, this is the same data left and right. You can't see and detect progress on the left-hand side. Ultimately, you'll see the logarithmic go flat, or what we call asymptotic, and then you'll see the same kind of pattern show up on the right. So let me show you what we could have noticed if we were really watching in the United States. This is coronavirus cases in Italy versus the United States. You could be forgiven if you look at this and think Italy is really in trouble. I mean, they're not having fun, and they did not flatten the curve relative to their healthcare system, and more people died than they should have. But check this out. So this is February 18th to March 19th, before the US is in any kind of response. You can see in the logarithmic form that Italy is bending that curve progressively forward, while the US is marching merrily on its way, doubling the number of cases every 2 days. Real obvious from that graph that the one in trouble is not Italy, but the one in trouble is the United States. And so if we move forward and just look at what happened after that, March 20, Italy has 3 times more cases than the United States. And it takes a while to slow this down. And so with their lockdown, they still saw cases triple, a 3.3x, by 18 days later. Meanwhile, the US responding quite a bit later, straight line, not good, 28 times more cases. And so to me, that's completely evident that you're heading on that path when you see the data in logarithmic form. Our linear brains have trouble grasping exponentials. Now let's look at what's actually happening in the US, because this is really good news. Not that you can tell by looking at the chart on the left. So remember, it's all about the shape of the curves. I'm going to zoom in on this logarithmic. And I'm going to point out that what you can see around March 20th is the beginning of a US response. Social distancing in New York, San Francisco, Pennsylvania came relatively early, Illinois came relatively early, some states came late. Some states, 6 states, never did implement a policy, but people aren't stupid. Eventually, people started behaving even in the states without edicts. Now, if you look at the data right there approaching March 20th, that is a roughly 2x in 2 days. Okay, doubling time, 2 days, that's bad. 20 days, 100,000%. But as we started to respond in this country, roughly 20 to roughly 40, 3 days, you can start to see you're slowing it down. And of course, you can see that curve is starting to bend. It's subtle, but it's starting to bend. 70,000 to roughly 140,000. Now we're at 4 days doubling time. Now, let's bring it up to current period. We are now, as of yesterday's data, at a 15-day doubling time. And if I just get rid of all my graphics here for a second, you can see beautiful progress on that logarithmic chart. That is really good news. That is viewed, the same exact data, in linear form, very hard to understand. So let me pause for just a second. That is our tool in dealing with exponentials. And after today, you're going to use it not just for COVID-19, but for a lot of things, I think. So questions or comments on that before we go a little bit further. I do want to talk ultimately about what are the key assumptions and what should your business be doing. We've got about 20 minutes left. So questions or comments. Remember, You can have all these slides. They're yours. I didn't copyright or label them. You don't have to attribute to me. They're PowerPoint or Keynote. Put them into your presentation, share them with your people. And by the way, if you get any challenges on any of this and you want the underlying spreadsheets or you want me to do some analysis or double check my math, please text me or email me. I'll repeat my contact info again at the end. Now, one of the things we're curious about, and one of the 5 big assumptions that could help us is this thing going to behave seasonally? You know, will it be different in warm weather? And all I want to point out is this. There's no science on this, so I'm just giving you a couple of observations. And again, subject to all of the caveats about known versus actual. But I think it's sort of interesting when you look at how this thing progressed in Australia. Pretty much a straight line there, and has got into some of the bigger cities, a little bit faster doubling right there. And you could see once they started distancing, then they started bending the curve. But to me, that looks awfully much like an exponential in a warm weather climate in February and March. Go to Brazil, it's sort of the same story. Until the distancing cuts in, I'm seeing roughly that straight line there. And so it's just something for you to consider. To me, what this says is, well, I don't like to plan my business based on luck anyway. I'm not planning on this thing to be seasonal. If it happens, great, I'll be happy. Now, be glad you don't live in Brazil. President Bolsonaro is calling the virus a measly cold. People, this thing isn't too important to deal with. And of course, you see as you look at the Brazil data, because of the conflicting messages coming from the top. I mean, all the governors in Brazil are, doing the same thing as, we are doing here in the US, but having the guy at the top conflicting messages, you're just not seeing the kind of slowing that you would want to see. And last time I ran the numbers for data through April 13th, Brazil doubling time, despite having started distancing before the US, is double what the US is. That's not good. And then last thought for you, and this is a really interesting one to keep an eye on, Sweden. By the way, all of these are available from worldometers.info. You might have noticed the links on some of the slides. Sweden is doing what I call distancing light. Authorities have recommended but not mandated social distancing. Now, people are smart, so there is a lot of social distancing going on, but maybe not so much if you're young and unafraid. The workplaces remain open. The bars and shops remain open. Now, I will tell you, I listened to an interview with one bar owner in Sweden, and he said he is managing the load in his bar like what we saw Costco doing, so there's a better chance of achieving the social separation. And by the way, he complained it's really hard around midnight when everyone's drunk to get compliance. They've closed their high school and colleges, okay? So they took that off the table. They have not mandated no travel, but they have suggested it, sort of the same policy there as the US. And they said no gatherings over 500 people, and then they revised that down to no gatherings over 50 people. Now you're looking at a logarithmic graph of what's going on in Sweden. And what I read here, remember, straight lines are bad. What I'm seeing is progress, because people are smart, but relatively little progress. And, Sweden's doubling time was always lower than ours. It's super cold there. The days are not very long. I don't think people intermix like they do in the US, in our big cities especially. I don't see huge progress. And if you run the numbers against what you might call their cohort, what you can see is Denmark, Norway, Finland taking more of a US kind of strategy. Doubling time in Sweden is substantially faster and not dropping compared to other Scandinavian countries. The population of Sweden is twice as much as each of Denmark, Norway, Finland, roughly 10 million versus 5 million, 5 million, 5 million. So on column E there, I just did a correction as if all places were equivalent population to Sweden, and you can see substantially higher deaths in Sweden than in any of the other countries in the area. Now, I'm not saying necessarily this strategy is bad. Sweden is moving towards herd immunity faster than Denmark and Norway and Finland, and maintaining compliance going forward is going to be one of the challenges for the US. And so there might be hotspots that break out where you have to lock down certain states or cities in the future. Maybe Sweden is on a better path, but I would just say watch the experiment and see how it goes. Okay, so after we've slowed this thing, because that's what we're working on, and we're probably, call it 3 months from that, depending on which of the models you believe. Only people who've contracted the virus, and my next word is selected intentionally, might have immunity. It's very possible that if you were asymptomatic with COVID-19, you might not have immunity. So we don't totally know that yet, but there seems to be some correlation between severity of symptoms and ability to reacquire the disease. So now let's say 13 million people got it. By the way, do the math. If we have a 2% mortality rate, then that means that we lost about 250,000 Americans in this thing. This is just a scenario, not a projection. But even if it were 13, or even if it's 26, you're nowhere close to most of the population, at least if this thing is behaving as we believe it's behaving. The vaccine may be a year away. If it comes earlier, great. So can't go back to the old normal. So some version of these current practices are going to be required for months, and I would run the scenarios for your business, the what ifs, the implications, the strategies. Now, the second thing that we have to pay attention to is not just the interaction among humans, but surfaces. And so this is New England Journal of Medicine, March 17th. This study, and there's a ton of graphs in there if you want to go dive into this, SARS-CoV-2, the COVID virus, was more stable on plastic and stainless than on other surfaces, but 72 hours still detectable. So you've got 3 days where the virus is deposited on a surface where it may still be acquirable from that surface. On cardboard, it's gone after 24 hours, but it's not probably gone after 1 minute. And so even things like cardboard and paper probably require certain handling protocols. And so what are your policies and practices with things like the phone that you handle when you're out and about? You come back, you wash hands, the virus is off your hands, you grab your phone, the virus is back on your hands again. Common surfaces like elevators or bathrooms. A mailbox, right? Your COVID positive mail carrier just came through, totally asymptomatic, so she doesn't know she's spreading this thing, but she handled that handle and the paper inside. How do you deal with it? The pizza's probably good. It's nice and hot, no virus there, but what about the box in which the pizza was delivered? Or something like plastic. And so that's why I get to these conclusions and the 3 priorities for your business. Now, what could change the picture for the better? Well, I've got 5 things on my list. Number 1, maybe we get lucky. Maybe this thing behaves seasonally like the flu. Could happen. I don't like to plan on luck, but if it happens, great. We'll all be happy. Number 2, viruses mutate, and they tend to mutate in a way that make them less lethal or potentially less contagious. This is what happened in 1918. So the thing is, if the virus is not very good at reproducing itself reliably, what happens is sometimes it's really deadly and sometimes it's not as deadly. The really deadly version of the mutation gets in a host and kills the host and then gets trapped. And so the deadly one doesn't necessarily get to propagate. The less deadly one goes on. And so it is an effect. So in 1918, eventually you had a lot of people with immunity, a relatively more distributed population than today, and that effect. I would say keep an eye on the Telluride antibody study. In the back of the deck, there's some slides on that. Number 3, we develop and deploy a new vaccine. That will happen. It just probably won't happen in 2020. Maybe we discover we've got something that has good antiviral properties and we can quickly treat people when they are infected. That would be great. There's a lot of tests going on right now, so we might have something. We might know that any day or any month or not at all this year. Maybe it doesn't exist. Number 4, this is the one that gets practical for us to operate on. N95 masks. If you have an N95 mask, and so does the person you're interacting with, you're both protected. Neither one of you is transmitting, neither one of you can acquire, as long as the masks are being used effectively. Now, right now, you cannot get N95 masks because there's a shortage. These should go. It's just the right thing to do to the healthcare providers because they're the ones on the front line, they're the ones in harm's way. But once production catches up and satisfies that need, then these masks will become available to the rest of us. So I see that as something very practical that we could use. And then finally, fast and continuous testing. Imagine if we get a test that's fast enough that you could apply it to every employee every day, and maybe they'd have to wait for 10 minutes in a quarantine area, but as soon as they're good, then they can cross into the sterile area and everybody in the operation is good. So fast and continuous testing probably plays a role. But as long as none of those 5 things happen, why are we waiting? Let's get back to business. Let's figure out how to achieve that social distancing. Let's figure out how to manage the surfaces. And let's figure out what to do with the employees' kids, or at least how to help them get into a more productive mode if their kids are still at home. So I'll pause. I've got a few slides to go through in closing, but that's the basic proposition. Now you've seen the data. You can see how to look at the data. All of this is drawn from CDC or WHO. Even the stuff I pulled off of Worldometers tracks back to CDC and the various US state departments of health. I think we need to really be careful with trusted sources and double check everything, and I've done my best to do that in laying this out for you. So questions or comments on where we've been? So go for it, Rick.
So I noticed you didn't have contact tracing in there. Is that just, you think it's not going to happen in the US, or like the laws won't allow for it, or?
That would be sort of part of what goes with number 5 with the testing. So once you find somebody that's tested, you would contact trace. And you notice now that our public health and political authorities are starting to talk about, here's the steps to relax, and one of them would be contact tracing. Right now, given the scale of this thing, we are so far from being able to do contact tracing in this country that I put it with number 5, but we've got a long way to go to get there, and might have civil liberties objections in terms of what would really need to be done. I mean, the ideal way, the phone location is and has been recorded, for decades, every 10 seconds for every person. And so what if we open up that data, for geographic and contact tracing? And what if we agree to open up our contacts even? So, I mean, there are a lot of things we could do. And this is some of what they're doing in South Korea. Really, first of all, everybody's got masks, right? And then they're monitoring locations. They're doing very strict contact tracing. And by the way, they intervened so quickly that they never had anywhere close to the propagation of the virus, which kept it, more doable. So it's part of number 5, and I hope that we, can employ that tool. Other questions or comments? I see there's one chat, so I'll just read that. So, okay. Thanks a lot, Daniel. So I'm glad you could join, and thanks for the positive feedback there. Other comments or questions?
I have a question.
Rob, yeah, fire away, Rob.
Yeah.
So
I wanted to ask you about the
1918 comparisons financially. How close do you think it matches the reality of 2020 in terms of what the business world is like? The forecast puts you out 4 years until the economy starts coming back. But is it really legitimate to compare it to 1918, or is it just sort of something to look at?
To me, what was interesting was not the duration, and so I'll comment on why I don't think that holds, but the hit to the GDP. And, it was this massive event that swept through the U.S. and really hit the 20 to 40 crowd hard, which is, sort of your core workforce, especially back then when it was a lot more physical labor than cognitive stuff. And so to me, what was interesting was that it was only 3%. I didn't know that until I went and looked it up, and I thought that was interesting. And then the ITR guys coming in and predicting 1.3%. And it just doesn't feel like that right now. It feels like, we're down, the GDP is going to go down 20%. And the point is that it's probably not going to be that big. It wasn't that big before. But the speed of business is much, much faster today and more global. And US GDP, you saw the number, 600 billion, now it's like 20 trillion, right? So it's a much, much bigger economy. And so everything's going to happen faster this time. And so, probably GDP is rising before the end of this year, and next year is positive. At least that's what the ITR guys say. So in that sense, I don't think it's a good precedent. My main use of that slide and that part of history is to emphasize that the magnitude might not be that big. Go ahead, Terry.
Yeah, I wanted to just get back to what I started with and then what you have in one of your assumptions about universities in K through 12 not picking
Yeah.
up in the fall. The data I'm getting from some universities is that kids are probably going to take a gap year. That is, that they're going to make a consumer choice that says, if you're going to have online classes for ballet, I don't want to do that in my living room. It's not a good value proposition for me. So I'm going to opt out and wait till things are back to normal when we can be together again, which now means that universities like Harvard, which have great endowment, are going to be okay, but that a number of schools are actually going to go out of business. And so even with the ITR 1.3% idea, that's kind of overall for the economy. There are certain businesses that are going to be hit much harder, for instance, mine. Or if we look at 2008, art galleries had a 40% year-over-year decrease. So I'm wondering what you might have to say about that, because even if we offer our services online, there are going to be a lot of people, including if I was a student, I'd say, I'm going to wait. I don't want to do it online. I can't do it in my parents' house with people watching me and bad internet connectivity and some of these other things, and what your thoughts might be about the pivot available there.
Yeah, the first thought is averages and statistics mean nothing compared to individual cases, and so there are some industries that are completely different than what the average would be, and in those industries, it's a whole different picture. I mean, right now airlines are down 95 to 96%, right? And so a lot of small restaurants aren't going to be coming back on the other side of this. Now, ultimately, I think humans' desire to eat out at restaurants will be about the same as it ever was eventually. And, so there'll be lots of opportunities for new restaurant openings and building market share from competitors that didn't make it through. With respect to both K-12 and universities, I expect that they're going to mostly try to go forward with online stuff, but I want to point you to what Denmark is doing, Terry. So go look at Denmark. They're bringing the youngest kids back into classrooms at half density, socially separated, and then they're adding facilities like churches and other places for the other half of the kids. And so Denmark is the leader in trying to do an experiment in, how can you resume education with physical co-location, but with these rules. And so I think that would point the way. And I guess what you say sort of makes sense to me, that, taking a gap year, if I really value the being together, but I'll turn that one around and just challenge you to say, what could you do that would make it compelling, given the constraints? And there might be some invention that you could come up with that would really make it, what would make it compelling? I want to point out that my wife and I are being very careful in this, not because we have any personal fear. I'm strong. I don't have any personal fear of COVID-19, but I'm being super careful wearing my masks. Even 3 weeks ago yesterday, I was in Costco. I was the only one with an N100 mask or any mask on at that time. But that said, my wife and I have twice gotten together socially with friends in person in the teeth of this thing. Now, what we did was we picked a local park. We met up, bring your own chair. And, Catherine and I would sit together as a unit, and Rich and Sue would sit together as a unit, but we're separated by at least 6 feet. Is it possible that you could frequently bring people together in an outdoor setting under maybe some kind of giant pavilion? When you're outdoors 6 feet apart, life is pretty safe. And so you can, in theory, still do a lot of stuff that's in person. And so if that were your offering and other people weren't, offering any kind of in person, then, maybe you're building market share. So I don't know, but I would challenge you to think through what would make it compelling, because I think we're going to be here, barring some good luck. I think we're in this situation for a while in this new normal.
So Dave, I know you have other slides, but I just want to say to Terry and everyone, I think it's our job as a group to help each other think about each one of our businesses and situations. That's what we can do for each other.
Yeah, totally agree, Norma.
Yeah, because we're smaller than the large schools, Terry, and there's maybe something intimate that you can offer, somebody else can offer in their business that The large companies can't.
Yeah, well, I'll close with sort of a summary slide, and there's a lot more here, so twice as many slides as we went through. But I think it maybe emphasizes the key point we're just starting to talk about. And by the way, I don't think there's ever been a more valuable time to be part of Vistage, because we can not just learn from each other, but learn from the collective Vistage network. Vistage is doing a lot of research, and in case you haven't participated on the My Vistage networks, there's a COVID network where people are talking about PPP and all that kind of stuff. So you have the ability not just to learn from the group, but from 24,000 other smart key executives and CEOs. But here's my closing thought. Ultimately, what the human mind can conceive and believe, it can achieve. And there's some science to back that up. So a researcher named Dr. Eve Masita has postulated a new theory that it is our beliefs that drive our behaviors, and our behaviors drive our outcomes. And so today we've got to figure out what we believe, and that will help us with higher probability get to the outcomes we want. And so I hope I've given you some data, some things to think about. I hope it turns out way better than the picture I painted. I hope, I made some real obvious mistake and I turn out to be an idiot. At least I'll be a very happy idiot when we get to the other side of this thing. But that's what the numbers show me. And I hope you'll share this with other people and spend some time thinking about, look at the rest of the slides, and ultimately form a belief that will bring you to an outcome that makes sense.
So Dave, thank you. I don't know how even to thank you a million for doing this with us pro bono. And everyone, I know this was a lot to absorb, and I think we can now have a meeting specifically to talk about each of our situations and how we can help each other think differently and pivot. Thanks again, Dave.
All right, thanks everyone. I always say stay healthy and help keep the economy moving. That's our job. All right, take care.
Thank you.
You too.
Thank you.
You.